So my name's Joe. I'm an F2 in Southeast Scotland. I'm currently on a GP rotation, having done some rotations in urology and medicine, and I'm actually about to be redeployed back to the hospital, but I'm sure we'll talk about that later in the foundation panel. So what I was hoping to talk about today is a bit of an introduction on QI projects. And love them or hate them, it's sort of a feature now in medical school and certainly going for your career forward. So QI projects stands for quality improvement. And what I was hoping to do, introduce a little bit about it, the importance of them, some steps to undertake a QI project, some tools that might be useful, and also use an example of a QI project that I've recently just finished to give you guys some ideas. What would be helpful is if in the chat you're able to mention what grades you are. That's Alicia, who's an F1 fab. So this talk is it'd be more targeted towards medical students, clinical year medical students, F1s, and I'll profess to say I'm by no means an expert in QI projects, but through what I've done recently, you can pick up some tips or some pitfalls. So what I'll do is just share my screen for the presentation. And just give me a second there. Fab. And let me just get that into presentation mode. Amazing. So, how to do a QI project. These are our objectives. Pretty straightforward what it says on the tin. So we'll just talk about what is a QI project, why it's important, etc. So jumping into it, what is a QI project? And these are just some definitions I've taken from online. So that quote there is from a paper from the BMJ last year. And that's actually quite a useful summary on QI projects, that paper, and I've got a reference at the back there. But essentially, quality improvement projects, they're about improving patient care, either directly, indirectly, through collaborative work, either working with other doctors, other medical students, allied health professionals, and identifying areas in the clinical environment where there might be failings or where things can be improved to improve patient care and the outcome there. And that sort of can happen at every level. So even on the ward itself, there's always going to be areas where things can be improved. So why are QIs important? And there's just a few points there. So it's actually a requirement of foundation training to be involved with a QI project. So there's a requirement there. And going forward into your higher specialty training, you're going to be required to complete QI projects. So it's worthwhile getting familiar with the process, the tools, etc., what's involved. And it's also beginning to be included in medical school curriculums, So I had attended medical school at King's, and they recently had a curriculum change, Curriculum 2020. So when I was transitioning through my third year to the fourth year, they introduced a QI module. And I remember at that time, I really wasn't sure what a QI project was. And even after the end of the module, I wasn't quite sure. And it was more of just a tick box exercise. But actually on reflection, it was a useful exercise to get us all introduced into what the process was. There were some teething issues with it, I think, but looking back, I wish I was a bit more proactive with it all, and it would have helped me at this stage having a bit more of that QI knowledge built up. The other point is QI projects are worth massive points in your specialty application. So for me, I'm interested in applying to IMT, and I'm working on my application at the moment. And this box on the side here, so that's just taken from the IMT application website. And you can see a fully designed, thought out QI project with a few cycles, and we'll go on that in a little bit, is worth 10 points. And to put that in perspective for IMT application, at least, the sort of median, the average applicant score is around 22, 23. So a QI project forms a massive part of that. And if you can get one under your belt, early doors and foundation training, it puts you in good stead. And every Royal College is going to give points for a QI project. It's also a part of good medical practice, and clinical audit is one of the 7 pillars of clinical governance. Don't ask me to quote all 7, but it's just in the wider picture, quality improvement, clinical audits are an essential part of the NHS. And to touch on the word clinical audit, QI projects, clinical audit, they're more or less the same thing. A clinical audit, sort of just a larger QI project over a longer piece of time, maybe a higher scope, but more or less the same. And then that final point, which I think it's one to emphasize. Actually, when you go into a new environment, either as a medical student, as an FY1, into a new department, you have a fresh set of eyes, and you can see around you all the shortcomings of the ward, mistakes that are happening that the station staff there are perhaps blind to or have been habituated to, so they don't appreciate the problems. So you have a really unique opportunity to actually see problems and potentially address them through QI projects. Cool. So how do we start with a QI project? It all depends on what level you're at. So if you're at medical school and there's a module, then that'll all be introduced to you and you'll find a lead. But at the F1 level, at the foundation level, if you're interested in getting involved, pretty much every department has a QI lead, and that's going to be a consultant. And just get a hold of them, and near enough of the time they'll have a couple of projects that are on the go or that they're wanting to try, and they just need some junior staff to sort of initiate the process. So it's worth touching base with that person, and they'll help support you through the way. You then need to brainstorm, come up with an idea, what's been a problem that you've encountered, and how do you go about addressing an improvement there? And then you begin. So you think about what improvements can be had, look at QI methodology to sort of structure your project, and then you just get going. It's useful to think about the SMART criteria. So that comes up a lot in QI talks, QI methodology, and it's all about these 5 aspects. So when you're coming up with a project, you want something to be specific. So for example, if you're on the ward and there's been a lot of prescribing errors, it's probably not good enough to say, oh, I want to improve the prescribing, because that's just so broad. And how do you define that? There's so many errors that could be had on a prescription chart. So you want to hone it down a little bit. Are there specific prescribing errors that you've come in, that you've encountered? Are people prescribing antibiotics incorrectly? Are they not writing down the indication, the length, when to review them. So hone it down to that level, and then think about, for our next point, how do you go about measuring that? So for whatever change you're making, or for whatever problem there is, you want to have a metric to quantify that by. So later on, I'll use my QI project as an example, and you can see how that feeds in. It may be a case, going back to that prescribing example, do you go through the prescription charts and count the amount of antibiotic prescriptions, how many of them are missing the indication? You then go suggest your improvement, whether that's information posters around the ward, and then look back and count the prescriptions again and see if how many errors are there. And then the next point again feeds into that. You want your project to be achievable. So it's great. We want to all reform the NHS as a whole, but we have to start with small steps. So you've got 4 months per rotation. It's a busy job that you'll be on. You're working weekends, you might be working nights. You want to make sure that your project, whatever you think about, that you actually can do it in that time. And of course, you want it to be relevant, which I think it will be, as nature of you being in the clinical environment and coming up with a problem. But just make sure whatever you're tackling is actually relevant to the workplace that you're in. And timely is just, you want to make sure that you can achieve your project, finish it on time, that you're not spending hours and hours after work measuring your intervention. So to help with QI projects, there's plenty of resources out there that look into QI methodology. And that can be helpful to initially structure your project, flesh it out a little bit. And there's countless ones. There's dozens of tools out there, and these are just 3 examples. The CHURAS website, and that's the website for Scottish FY trainees, but it's accessible to all. They have loads of great resources for QI tools, and I've put a link at the end of the slide for that website. But just to go into 3 examples, so a force field analysis is you're listing on the left-hand side all the causes for change. So everything. So you've sort of listed your problem. On the left side, the causes that are forcing that change, and then on the right side, the forces that are against that change. Process mapping, and the next slide will be a bit of an example for that, so we'll talk about that in the next slide. Cause and effect is also known as a fishbone diagram. So you've got your problem where the effect is, so whether that's reduced prescribing or prescribing errors, antibiotic prescribing errors, and then you're looking at all the causes that are contributing to those prescribing errors. And it may be things that you can't really tackle, but it's still worth thinking and listing them as contributing effects. So the time it takes, the workload for the doctor, so those are going to be factors that are contributing to errors there. Is there lack of education on specific sort of antibiotics, gentamicin, and how to prescribe that? So you might want to look at the education sort of side. Are the proformas for specific antibiotics, are they obtuse? Are they a cause of a lot of errors and confusion? So it's just about picking out all those potential contributors and then coming up with ideas how to address them. So this is just an example of process mapping, and it's not specifically about QI projects, but it's still it's useful to look at the example and what it's about. So process mapping is looking at a process and understanding the processes that are involved with it, essentially. So this one is an example about making a tea, and you can see at the various different steps, how does one go about making a tea? And you can then think about, well, how does one go about, what are the processes involved with prescribing an antibiotic? And actually by listing all these processes out, finding out the clinical the clinical indication of the patient. Do they have a chest infection? Checking your prescribing criteria at your trust, listing the patient's regular medications. And by going through this process, you can also identify errors or pitfalls that might be contributing to prescribing errors. And again, there's examples on the NHS website there, so that website's listed. So once you've thought about an idea, then you start thinking about PDSA cycles, and QIP projects are all about these. And what it stands for is plan, do, study, act. So you've identified your problem, and you're thinking about how you want to quantify and qualify it, and think about your interventions. So that's your first step. You then do your first measurement. So you want to get your baseline of how things are, and then you implement your intervention, whether those are posters, education sessions, a change in pro forma. You do that for a period of time, and then you want to measure the outcome of that intervention. So you're repeating that measurement step. You analyze that data, so that's in your study stage. And did it make an improvement? Was the improvement as much as you'd expect? From that point, you then look at that data and you want to action it. So that then feeds into your next cycle. So from that improvement, can we make a further improvement? Or did that intervention that we had implemented, had that caused unforeseen harmful effects? So you want to study the outcome, and then you implement your second cycle. So for all QI projects, the sort of the baseline, as it were, is you want to implement 2 cycles. And it doesn't have to be that there's an improvement. It could have been a failure, but it's something that you've tried. So it's an intervention one way or another. You want 2 cycles to at least complete it. When thinking about your PDSA cycles, you want to think about your different measures, and that's another useful way of framing your QI project. And if you're writing this up formally, it's worth writing about these things specifically. So your outcome measure is what we sort of already touched on, your primary objective, and how are you going to quantify or qualify it? You also want to think about your process measures. So any intervention that you make, you want to measure, actually, is that process working? And to sort of give an example, let's say you make an intervention for antibiotic prescribing errors, whether it's an education session. Are people actually going to that education session? Because it's all very well good in holding it, but if people aren't attending, then your intervention isn't going to work if people aren't going to it. So it's worthwhile actually checking, are people using these tools, the new pro forma that you've introduced, are people using it? And then you also need to think about balancing measures. So anything you introduce, is that having unforeseen consequence on other aspects in the workplace? So is your pro forma that you've introduced, whether it's incredibly well set out, well thought, is it just taking the person an incredible amount of time to go through your pro forma for gentamicin, for example? And is it adding workload to them. So you might want to take a questionnaire of the ward. How are they finding your intervention? Is it being obstructive? So I thought would be handy is actually going on and talking about a QI project that I've recently undertaken and I'm just about to finish and present it at a local meeting. So hopefully it will bring the points I've already spoken about together. What I'd like to check is see if there's been any questions at this stage. Where are we going? No questions at this stage, but feel free to, for any questions at any point. So this is a project that I sort of began, it was summertime, spring, summertime. And I was working on medicine in the District General Hospital. And I was sort of sitting with one of my colleagues and we were talking about discharge summaries for our patients. And at our hospital, there's so the notes are all on an electronic system. And when the patient's about to be discharged, you're writing it your discharge summary. And you can actually put a backslash note into the discharge section, and that comes up with a pro forma, and that's generally what everyone uses to structure their discharge summary. And there's a few different sections in it, so the diagnosis, the sort of clinical course, the follow-up, etc. And then there's a line in the pro forma about anticipatory care and changing DNA CPR status. And we were talking amongst ourselves and we said, actually, that line, I've always ignored it. You know, I've never, it's never triggered for me or caused a reflex to actually check, has the patient we're discharging, have they had a new DNA CPR status change? And actually, are we not documenting it? Because for whatever reason, when that pro forma comes up for me, it's something that I tend to omit. And that's a failing on my hand, but what I wondered is actually, are the rest of the FYs who are writing discharge summaries doing this as well? Now, around the same time, the department had received some complaints from GPs in the local area saying that the discharge summaries were lacking, specifically around DNA CPR. So actually, it did seem like there was a problem here. And going back to the sort of definition of QI projects, by not accurately documenting that DNA CPR status change and informing their GP about it, you're losing that handover between secondary and primary care. And GP then no longer, they don't know that conversation's been had and whether the patient's agreed to it, whether there's this form in place. And if there were to be a terminal event to happen in the community, that form is then not there, and the patient might be getting unnecessary intervention that there was already a form in place in a hospital to say that this isn't what should happen. So there is a indirect patient care aspect to it. So going into our cause and effect diagram of the problem, so the problem here is we were having poor communication of our DNA CPR conversations and writing them in our discharge summaries. And unpicking it a little bit, what were the things that were contributing to that? And sitting down and going through the problem, this is what I'd come up with. So starting in the top left, over here, actually the conversation, the DNA CPR conversation, often the documentation of that was quite brief between the registrar and the patient. And when it came to the FY writing the IDL, the discharge summary, there was very little information to actually take from there. So there wasn't much to work from to actually write in the discharge summary. The discharge pro forma that I had mentioned before, where they had that line about changing DNA CPR status, that it was still a little bit lacking because it didn't prompt you to say whether the patient was in agreement, whether this form was going home with them. And that was a potential source of problem, or a potential contributing effect to the problem that we're having here. Then general education around DNA CPR and DNA CPR conversations. So are the people writing the pro formas, are they aware of what's involved in the conversation? Are the conversations actually being had by experienced members of staff? So at my hospital, it was anyone from F2 and above, and perhaps you could argue that F2's having a conversation, perhaps it wasn't as comprehensive or as thought out, and therefore the documentation may have been poorer, the quality of the conversation would have been poorer, and that would have caused problems in the communication of that DNA CPR status change. Again, going on to uncertainty on the details. So actually, what information do we need to put into our IDLs, our discharge summaries, about DNA CPR? So it kind of adds to the other points. Also, the awareness of a status change in the DNA CPR. So the way our system works, you've got our e-notes, and there's pages and pages and pages of it. So if that conversation had been had earlier on in the mission, by the time the patient's being discharged, the person writing the letter has not gone back far enough in the notes to see that conversation. And then, of course, this all takes time, and we're all busy, and extra work. It's easier to make a brief, concise discharge summary as opposed to adding in those little extra bits of information. So that was our sort of cause and effect analysis. So we wanted to come up with a way, actually, how are we going to measure this problem? And we came up with a criteria to measure the quality of our DNA CPR statuses. Our DNA CPR status documentation in those discharge summaries. And speaking to one of the registrars in geriatric medicine, this is what we came up as what we felt should be included in our discharge summaries. So when the conversation was had, the actual place of the conversation, whether the DNA CPR status change was discussed with the patient and with their family, and actually was the patient in agreement with it. So you can have situations where clinically you put in a DNA CPR form. The patient may not be in agreement with it, but it's a clinical decision. But that stays within the hospital, so there's no requirement for the patient to actually go home with that form. So leading into the next point, is the form following the patient home? And the final point, and this is specific to my region, it might be slightly different where you are in the rest of the country. So in Scotland, we have this thing called the Key Information Summary. And it's something all primary and secondary care can access, but it's the GPs who actually update the form itself. But whenever someone comes in, we can look at their KISS summary and we can see, is there a DNA CPR status on there? This patient is not for CPR. So by asking the GP to do that, if there is a change, you're keeping that continuity, that chain between admissions. So the next time that patient's admitted, they can see, oh, this conversation's been had. So we had our criteria, and then what we did is we picked one of our general medical wards, and we measured over a week all the patients that had been discharged. We looked at their discharge summaries, and first we counted the amount of DNI CPR status changes. So for each of the patients, we actually went through the notes, and we went through all the notes during the mission to see actually was there a conversation. Did that conversation then find itself on the discharge summary? And then how well was that documented on discharge summary? So did they include those 6 criteria, or how many of the criteria did they include? Our interventions were, so we had 3 cycles, and the first wasn't really one we implemented, so whether we can actually take credit, but it was a useful one to see if there was a change. So at this time, the coronavirus was, the situation with coronavirus was at full swing, so DNA CPR was very much at the forefront of everyone's mind. And with our e-system, they implemented it. They put in a change where if a patient was not for resus, there was an icon that you could fill, and it would fill up the patient's notes, so you could see it on the ward plan that this patient isn't for DNA CPR, or sorry, is not for CPR. And we wondered, does that icon act as a prompt for whoever's writing the discharge summary? Is that improving the quality of the communication? So that was our first step. Our second step was then to introduce to the FY doctors a general teaching session. So that was a session held by that registrar in geriatric medicine, talking generally about DNA CPR, so not necessarily going into the criteria, but what we wondered is if we could introduce a regular teaching session in the curriculum for FYs about DNA CPR, does that then improve the conversation, the communication? Our final intervention was what we felt was that it tends to be FY doctors who are writing discharge summaries. So every time there's a new cohort, every 4 months, to include in their induction day a dedicated 5-10 minutes about the quality of discharge summaries and what the criteria we explicitly want them to include. So that was our third intervention, and we had measured a week post each one of these. And that's just to go into our different, mentioning about our different measures. So as mentioned already, our outcome, our overall objective, 2 discharge summaries have improved DNA CPR communication as measured by our criteria after our interventions. Now our staff as process measures for that first intervention, our staff actually still including the DNA CPR icon, so that was a thought to have. Were staff actually attending the induction, which they should be, or attending the education sessions, which they should be. And then as just to be aware of, was this having unintended consequences, and were these changes sustainable? So just applying our measures there. Going into the results of it all, and really it's this bottom line, which is a key one. So those are our 4 timeline events. So pre-intervention is this column. So we have 30 discharge events over a week. In that time, we had 5 new DNA CPR status changes. And of those, actually only 4 of them communicated the decision of all. And of them, the average criteria out of 6 was a 1.8. So a pretty poor baseline. We then did that again after the icon change. So those are our discharge events, 62, new DNA CPR status changes 10. And again, the majority of them communicated it, although you'd hope all of them had. But actually, interestingly, it looks like that intervention worsened things for whatever reason. So the average DNA CPR criteria went down to 1.2. is interesting. Why did that happen? It's funny, and it's a little unclear. And again, when we did our second cycle, lo and behold, it went down again. So as I was saying earlier, your interventions don't actually have to have an improvement, but it's important you analyze and you undertake the measures. And then finally, with the induction speech and the induction criteria, and actually speaking specifically about DNA CPR criteria, we then did manage to improve the quality. We're still not getting the full criteria on average, but actually we've made a big improvement from 1.8 to 3.2. And this is a sustainable intervention. So we could say actually at every single induction, let's list, for the FYs, let's list the criteria explicitly that they need to include on the discharge summaries for a DNA CPR status change. And that's just another way to represent things. So that was our measure. So this is out of 6, our criteria on our DNA CPR communication. So that's where we were at the very beginning. It went down again after the teaching session, and then finally we've actually made an improvement with the induction. So once you've gone through the whole process, you then want to give your recommendations. So ours would be, let's include a DNA CPR information slide during induction. And also think about, well, if this was to go on further, what additional cycles could we add? What other improvements could we add? So what I would like next is to actually adjust the IDL pro forma. So it lists those 6 criteria, so the person's prompted to fill them out. And then within the notes, having a backslash DNA CPR conversation. So whoever is having that conversation, again, lists the key criteria. So whoever is then writing the discharge letter has that to work from. And remember, these changes have to be sustainable. So it's all well and good doing a one-off education session, but then that's lost with new people coming in. Fab. I'll just check if there's any questions at this stage. So there's a question from Richard Slatter about who's able to take part in QI projects. So it's everyone, anyone really. So there's a requirement as a foundation doctor to have one, to have completed one. As a specialty trainee, you'll be expected to do QI projects. And then throughout your career, you'll probably be, as a consultant, involved in QI projects. But certainly as a medical student, whether it's part of your curriculum or not, it would be welcomed by any department, I'm sure, to approach the QI lead and say, listen, I'm interested in being involved in a QI project. So, and this list is by no means exhaustive, but perhaps areas of inspiration for your QI project. So speak with with your allied health professionals in your department, the nurses, the pharmacists. What problems have they encountered? What are they frustrated with? And then are there things specifically that you can do to address those things? So pharmacists, they would be a really rich resource of problems, pet peeves that they encounter. I know, and I still do, we all make prescribing errors, and there might be ones that come up more commonly than others. And it would be worthwhile working with the pharmacy team to see, can we come up with ways to lessen those errors? Have you been involved with a significant event in your department, or was there a significant event in the department? And actually, can there be areas of improvement around there? And it's looking at the events that led to that significant event happening. What can we do to circumvent that next time? Do you find things Do you find something specifically on the ward that's just inefficient, frustrated? Are you having to submit paper referrals for echoes that get lost? Is there an expedited way we can do this? Can we change the form? Can we make it electronic? So those sorts of things. Is there a trust guideline that's really outdated, actually has caused patient harm, or the hyperkalemia guidelines really obtuse? And has someone received too little treatment, too much treatment because the guidelines aren't specific enough, or are the DKA guidelines, are they lacking? So there's areas of improvement everywhere in the ward, and it just, I don't think it takes much to find them. So that sort of begins to round things up. Here are some useful resources. So that top one is the Scottish education website, and it's accessible to all, and they have some wonderful QI project tools. So templates for the fishbone diagram, the cause and effect analysis, and they have examples on the website to get you going to help flesh out the ideas. And then the Royal College of GPs actually have a wonderful section on QI projects as well, and they list a few examples. So if you're beginning to get into a QI project, either through your medical school as part of the curriculum or as an FY, that'd be a useful place to start looking, to look at examples and how the projects are carried out. And that's just my reference section. So that's the BMJ article I mentioned at the very beginning. So that concludes my presentation. It would be great to have some questions, or if you had any points that you'd like to clarify on there. So a question from Richard, do we openly talk about these things in sessions within the hospital? Yes, and this might not answer your question entirely. So you'll certainly meet with the QI lead to discuss a problem, but for most of the QI projects, once you've come to the end of it, usually what will happen is you present it within the departmental meeting. So within medicine, at my hospital, every Tuesday they have a meeting, and all the consultants, all the juniors are there. So you can present your work and make everyone aware of what's been going on. So that's a useful way to share the ideas and the progress that you've made. Does that answer the question? Sort of. Is there anything, can I expand on that in any way? Was there something specifically that you had in mind there? Yeah, so I think in an informal sense, when you're on the wards in the doctor's office, it'd be a pretty common topic of conversation. Someone might be talking about a QI project they're involved, or just even taking that a step back, people are talking about things that they're frustrated about within the department. And sometimes those conversations can then develop into a QI project. I hope that adds to the answer there.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe, for an amazing talk. I loved how you used a case study of your own experiences to explain how to approach a QI project. In fact, I'd just like to ask a very quick question myself,
Yeah.
expanding on which, if there's, if you can talk about these projects rather than just amongst staff. And I know that there are a lot of opportunities to present
Hmm.
your projects in local, um, sometimes conferences, and opportunity to expand on these projects further. I was wondering if you considered presenting your projects elsewhere.
Yeah. So there are national QI conferences. For the one I've just carried out, I've not. I would like to at some point submit it to a, a higher level conference, and there's certainly ones out there. I suppose we're in a unique situation at the moment with coronavirus, where a lot of these conferences are happening virtually, or you're not having an opportunity to speak about them. But this is at the moment this is an exception, as opposed. Well, I hope it's not the new normal. Um, for me, with this project, I'm in a situation where I'm trying to really fit those points criteria for my specialty application. Hence why I'm happy with just having it presented at a local meeting for now, because that fulfills those criteria. But it'd be something I'd be interested in doing or looking for.